welcome to season 2. I thought I'd never be able to say that. Kind of caught us at a weird time. Drew and I are out in Van Meter, Iowa, chasing down these monsters in the early 20th century. First, it's one of many that exist throughout the United States, and they all go by a certain name, cryptids. So what are these creatures, and who are people who love them? Well, that and more after the title card.
The story will continue after this.
Now, I've always had a soft spot for cryptids, so you'll be happy to know that this video was the first one I pressured the crew to start working on after Season 1 was finished. But there is one question I need to get out of the way, and I think it's something we all would like to know about. What is a cryptid? Well, if you aren't like me and didn't grow up watching every single show on the Travel Channel that had Don Wildman, reading both creepypastas and this book right here, which you can only find at classic book fairs for some reason, cryptids are the creatures that exist somewhere between real and fiction. Think the local legend of the frogmen who appear around your neighborhood at night, or the giant ape story that every region has at least one of. While if you want a clearer definition, stuff like Bigfoot, Mothman, the Mongolian deathworm, and the mysterious creature known as my live-action form.
Yep.
The cryptid community is people who have expressed interest in documenting these creatures, or they just like them because they're cool. They take a more scientific approach to the study and hopeful documentation of these creatures, and some have even been lucky enough to have seen a few in person. So how did this community start? And is it just a thing we see a lot of here in the States, or something more? Well, buckle up. It's a bit of a journey. Since the beginning of human history, we have had a way of creating creatures that can both answer the mysteries of the unknown and help shape a society to view the world a certain way through reinforcing customs and taboos. The mythology of early civilizations, be it Minoan, Xia, or Babylonian, ranged from great gods for fire and wind to creatures that never did exist. The Minotaur, Eastern and Western concept of dragons, Humbaba, or even the more outlandishly interesting creatures from Aboriginal mythology. These beasts would exist for heroes to defeat or aid them in their conquest. So, more side characters and villains than anything. It would be after the Western Roman Empire's fall that cultures worldwide would help birth the creatures we know, and a few we forget. Creatures ranging from headless men to Japanese demons, Nordic sea beasts, and countless others dotting European bestiaries and Asiatic tales which would tell of mysterious creatures we share a world with. But before I dive into fictionalism and folklore, we have to again state that these creatures, be they folklore or map decoration, helped humanity understand the perceivably unexplained. Mythology will always have its ways of helping any culture understand the world through whatever lens is necessary. But how did we shift from mythical creatures to just outright strange beasts hiding beyond the veil? Well, for that we'll have to look at this new land across the water some Italians, Portuguese, and Spanish kept bumping into on their way to India. These fearsome critters, as later American settlers would dub them in the 18th century, were creatures closer to what we would consider cryptids. Tall tales of beasts like the Jersey Devil, Hoogag, Snallygaster, and even the beautifully named Goofus Bird dotted the new country's campfires and taverns. Around the 19th century, we can start seeing a line get drawn between legendary creatures and cryptids. If some of those examples could have been seen as pure myth, then a new era of plausibility would help lay the foundation for the cryptid community. In 1886, one of the first cryptozoological works was published. Mythical Monsters, a catalogue of fictitious creatures ranging from pterodactyls to the Australian bunyip, was offered by one Charles Gould, a geologist and land surveyor who took part in 3 expeditions to Tasmania. Gould's book would be the first of many to cover the creatures that exist in blurry camera footage and countless hoaxes. Later, in the Belle Epoque, would come a tale of folklore bled into horror. Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo, a tale about a fictional encounter with the Algonquin spirit in the lakes of Canada, would stoke the imaginations of countless writers of horror and other tales of mythical creatures. But this leans more into influences for Lovecraftian horror. We really don't see any use of cryptid-like creatures being used for horror until at least the 50s, with some B-movies here and there. Luckily, across the ocean, and around the same time as Blackwood, one man began to account anomalies of the early 20th century, or as he would call them, the damned. Charles Fort was an American writer and researcher, looking into anomalies and the occult. His work, The Book of the Damned. The damned in this case were, as Ford puts it,
"By the damned, I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. The power that has said to all these things that they are damned is dogmatic science.
This procession of his ranged from ghosts and zombies to beasts that science would only say were pure hoaxes. And it would be thanks to him that we have the term Fortean, which loosely covers all fields that have been based on parts of Fort studies. It would be the mindset of the community for decades to come, to find proof of these damned and show that science was not all that perfect in its hypotheses and methods. The works of Gould, Blackwood, Fort, and similar authors would help future communities of horror, science fiction, the supernatural, and yes, even the cryptid community find things that they too knew science would resent greatly. By the 1950s, two other men helped bring the cryptozoology community more into the eyes of the general public. Ivan T. Sanderson, a British naturalist who had a history of exploration in the tropical zones in search of creatures. This would lead him into an encounter with the Central African Oliatau, a large, bat-like creature presumed to exist in Cameroon. This finding, along with influences by Charles Fort and Sanderson's own research into the natural world, would help steer him into creating a field he dubbed cryptozoology in the late 40s. Working alongside Sanderson in this brave new field was Bernard Heuvelmans, a Franco-Belgian zoologist who was inspired by the fictitious works of Verne and Doyle to dive into the research of unknown creatures. Heuvelmans is more known of the two for his works on the subject, like 1958's On the Track of Unknown Animals, a collection of tales of creatures that might exist within our world. The duo would birth the field of cryptozoology as we know it in that decade up until the 60s, working with others in the field to compile research over beasts like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and even the elusive Oliatau. Others ranging from journalists to anthropologists and zoologists would join in the study and cataloging of these creatures independently or within organizations. By 1965, the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained formed in Washington, D.C. Headed by Sanderson, they would do as their name implied and search for the unexplained, be it cryptid, ghost, or UFO. I would say more on the group, but much of Sanderson's archival work for the organization has been scattered throughout the world and behind paywalls after C2's dissolution in the 1980s. All I can truly say is that they helped set precedent for cryptids keeping it weird in its pursuit of the paranormal within their newsletters, reports, and documentation of the wild world around them. Heuvelmans himself would found the International Society of Cryptozoologists in 1982, serving more as an academic research body for the field. On a bit of a tangent, for a while, these people were actively hunting what could be dubbed monsters. You see, the term cryptid first appears in the 80s, thanks to the effort of J.E. Wall not wanting the term monster thrown about for all mysterious creatures. Other groups would appear in this time as well, groups like the Center for Fortean Zoology in the UK, Russia's Kosmopoisk, and even the lovely handful of American groups that are filling the rest of this screen. Many groups would appear throughout the last 2 decades of the 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st. Which now gets us to the modern cryptid community of the last 20 years. Cryptozoology is a lot like ufology, which is the study of UFOs and other unknown space entities, both working under the label of pseudoscience and dealing in Fortean anomalies. And they do work together sometimes. Given the last 2 decades, the cryptid community is still as dedicated as their predecessors to finding those creatures that lay just outside the realms of reality. Cryptozoology and ufology have worked together on projects regarding creatures that could fall into both categories, such as the Flatwoods Monster, Dover Demon, and whatever little creatures someone said they saw fall from the sky. Both movements haven't changed much aside from the loss of big names and the gain of more technology whilst fighting the scientific world to prove that their claims are real. It should also be mentioned that since at least the late 90s, there have been countless programs on networks like History, Sci-Fi, and Travel Channel documenting hunts and tales of countless cryptids. Shows like Finding Bigfoot, Monsters and Mysteries, and whatever else is popping up on the screen would stoke the imaginations of countless viewers and even inspire a handful to look more into these creatures. Nowadays, there are also cryptozoological organizations still in operation the world over. And while I have looked into groups like Info, this hasn't really gotten me anywhere. It's more because their website hasn't been updated in close to a decade now. Before I have to go full journalist mode and email half a dozen people, and seeing as I'm up to my neck in other work, I will withhold from going overboard on anything that isn't secondary research or editing. So if I can't get any conversational information from cryptid groups about who they are, what can we find out from my precious secondary sources? Like I said a little earlier in the video about the modern cryptozoology community, these fine folks are still searching for creatures that may exist somewhere out in our world like their precursors did. Few within the cryptozoology community come from scientific backgrounds, but luckily, key figures throughout the years have had experience in scientific fields. William Corliss was an American writer and physicist, someone considered a successor to Charles Fort. He was more scientific-leaning than his predecessor, looking more into astronomical, meteorological, and geographical paranormalities compared to Fort's wider-angle approach. Corliss's research into cryptozoology was documented in several books in his biological anomalies series that ranged from human to other mammals. He even wrote one about birds. A more cryptid-oriented figure by comparison was the late Dr. Roy Mackal, an American biologist and vice president of the ISC when Heuvelmans was at the helm. Mackal's work seemed to have focused more on dinosaur-like creatures, such as the Mokele Mbembe and the Loch Ness Monster, along with publishing a book on each creature and a work on general cryptozoology. Mackal's involvement in the cryptozoology subculture is controversial, as it is known that he never did any doctoral research into anything biological outside of virology and biochemistry. Critics have used his inexperience with exotic creatures and zoology as a point that cryptozoology as a science would rather tout titles than research. I should also mention anthropologists and zoologists like Dr. Michael Ames, John Bindernagel, and some others who follow in the footsteps of Sanderson and Heuvelmans in their endless search to prove these creatures real. But let's not forget the handful of journalists, creative types, and other mediums who have joined in the research of cryptids, making it a field that holds no barrier to entry if you have a blurry camera and some anecdotal evidence. So why do these believers go out into the woods or lakes and look for these majestic beasts? Now, this may be my inner folklorist talking, but one idea that's been floating around my mind while writing this is that cryptids are the myths and legends of modern times. That being said, a lot of the original study of cryptids was based on seeing the reality in folklore creatures. Because, well, cryptids are just folklore creatures in the community's eyes. Now, why people want to seek out creatures like Bigfoot, Mothman, or even the irradiated chicken breast at Kamchatka is completely subjective. Whether it be out of an intense curiosity as to what really is out there, a love of cryptids thanks to popular media, or just a Fortean desire to tell the scientific world that these creatures are real. The reason people fall into the cryptozoology community varies along these two lines. The only question now is, where does the line get drawn between folk creature and cryptid? Going off of the definition of a cryptid being a creature that is presumed to exist based off of anecdotal or folkloric evidence, you can see there is already some bleeding over of the two fields of study. On one hand is folklore studies, a subfield of anthropology which studies tales and legends from cultures. On the other sits cryptozoology, which merges the idea of folklore and biology into a Fortean field that skirts the line between the two. There is some confusion with the two, as folklore is a starting point for cryptozoological research, but they are two distinct fields. It can be argued, however, that creatures like Mothman, the Jersey Devil, and Nessie are part of the folkloric catalog. Luckily, there is a phrase we could use to make things easier. A phrase I came upon in one research article was the term cultural meme, which refers to cryptozoology mimicking the culture of the time for these creatures. Think about it. During the early days of the subculture, researchers were looking for beasts that were more dinosaur-related, like Nessie, Champ, or the many serpents and scaled beasts that were out in the African bush. It would later move to a brief stint with ufology in its heyday of the late 40s and early 50s, a lot of missing link Bigfoot curiosity in the 60s and 70s, even through now with the reemergence of ufology in the mainstream and countless programs documenting creatures in Appalachia. These cultural memes could be interpreted as folklore of the last century, but folklorists and cultural anthropologists don't find that too flattering a classification. It seems that branches of the cryptid community would rather call folklore cryptids than the other way around. You see, folklorists and a few other people, including your lovely host right here, are not happy with the broad scope of the cryptid community's classifications. Because beings like the Wendigo, Thunderbird, and other creatures like Baba Yaga are being called cryptids by a few organizations and loose cannons. There is an obvious line that has to be drawn between the two, and arguments have been made between folklorists and other researchers on what constitutes what. Atlas Obscurica has listed folklore creatures as cryptids, either out of laziness or misuse of the term. There is a large misuse of First Nations mythologies as cryptids, much like with the Wendigo and Thunderbird, where it can be argued that people theorize they exist because they didn't originate in European or Asian folklore. But then there's the issue of creatures like the Himalayan Yeti, a creature of folkloric origin that has gained popularity in the cryptid community thanks to similarities of Bigfoot, which itself originates from various cultures like the Chehalis. So, to the surprise of no one, I'm siding with the folklorists here. The cryptid community is after things which may not exist, but have the possibility of existing, wherein folklore is creatures and events that are used to explain the happenings in the world. There is an understandable mix of the mythical and reality with cryptids that does lead some wanting to throw them into folklore and mythology. Maybe cryptids and urban legends that are myths and folklore of our time, ready for historians to dig up centuries from now, much like us and the cultures that came before. There also seems to be a hemispheric divide between mythology and cryptid. A good portion of what can be dubbed cryptids comes from the Americas, with only a few spatterings existing throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. Add to that a good chunk of folklore beasts being in that murky water between cryptid and myth, and you get a giant, tangled mess that I do not want to tread back through, but I may be doing that in the future. So, just to restate, there is some hatred of cryptozoology by the folklore community for these reasons. But are there other issues with these pursuers of fantastic beasts? The largest and most straightforward criticism for the cryptozoology community is that they are persistent in the continued existence of a pseudoscience. Not to mention their rejection of mainstream scientific association due to arguments from as early as Fort detesting the dogmatism of the scientific process. But the scientific community doesn't seem to care about the insular nation of cryptozoology or any other pseudoscience. They see no legitimate connection between the field and zoology, but some have acknowledged the very loose connection to folklore studies. Most cryptid research has been conducted on little to no anecdotal evidence, causing it to fall into the folklore studies ballpark. But as we covered earlier, cryptozoology isn't folklore either, at least in our connotations of folklore studies. Cryptozoology is basically fiction writing, with some real-life influences. It opens itself almost like folklore, telling tales of fantastical beasts and where to possibly find them. But many of these sightings are either misinterpretations of local fauna, tales taken out of proportion, or imaginative hysteria, hence its confusion of folklore. Will this single criticism turn people off of cryptozoology? Probably not. There are people out there like me who like the paranormal occurrences in the world, even if they are just mannequins and seagulls covered in curry powder. Well, as you can see, our search for the monster didn't go that well. And since we're back in the studio, I'll just admit that I thought looking for a pterodactyl in the Midwest might have gone a bit better. The good news is we didn't run into my anime rival who studies archaeology. We did, however, find this in the hunt. The cryptid community, everyone. A group of people out looking for creatures that may exist, and may have been doing so for close to a century. People may argue that they're just looking for modern myths and folklore, but to them, it's a whole new world science would never dare to meddle with.
Welcome back, dear listeners. It's time once again to put aside all you think you know, all you believe to be true. Time to open your mind to the strange, bizarre, and sometimes terrifying world that exists in the shadows and fringes of our own, where myth, legend, and rumor are made real. Yes, it's time for more thrilling tales from the West Virginia hills.